Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone here today. This is the Houston Schiller Institute briefing for Saturday, August 12th. And I'm Joe Jennings. And I apologize for having these three ugly fellows up here on the screen in front of us here today, but that's what we're going to talk about. The name of this briefing is Who Are These Creeps? Because you've seen them all. You've seen them in congressional testimony hurling all sorts of vile accusations at President Trump about collusion with Russia, hacking of elections, undermining democracy. And it's actually resulted in just before Congress fled out of Washington for its summer recess, they voted up sanctions almost to a man, Democrats and Republicans, which all things, except for our intervention as a movement, could actually lead the world toward war. There's an intervention that we just initiated yesterday, which I want Mike to show us right now. This is the petition. I'm going to read it to you as Mike brings it up, to President Trump. Lyndon LaRouche has stated that with respect to the ongoing fraudulent Russiagate scandal directed at President Trump, that the American people must demand that the ongoing treasonous British coup against the presidency and the nation itself must be stopped and the perpetrators prosecuted and imprisoned. We, the undersigned, agree with that statement and the following. The Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity has presented evidence to President Trump that Russia never hacked the Democratic National Committee. The emails in question were leaked by an insider, not hacked, and were subsequently altered to attribute responsibility to Russia. A new special prosecutor should be appointed to investigate those responsible for perpetrating the resulting hoax, which has so damaged and divided our nation. Two, there is abundant evidence in the record showing that British institutions and agencies conducted a concerted attack on candidate and now President Donald Trump in order to influence and then reverse the US election result. The actions of former MI6 agent Christopher Steele and his firm Orbis Business Intelligence involved in creating false and salacious accusations against the president after being paid over $1 million by supporters of Hillary Clinton, are fruitful targets for investigation, as are the actions of GCHQ, the General Command Headquarters, which is the British equivalent of the National Security Agency. If British interference is shown by a new special prosecutor's investigation, the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain should be canceled in all respects. In the words of Lyndon LaRouche, cancel the British system, save the people. Now, just so you know, the Veterans and Intelligence Professionals for Sanity are indeed professionals. These are people that served in the National Security Agency, like William Binney, Ray McGovern of the CIA, who briefed presidents and presidential staffs from John Kennedy on forward, Scott Ritter, who was the weapons inspector in Iraq, whose warnings about no Iraqi weapons of mass destruction were ignored as we plunged into that war. And former Senator Mike Gravel, who courageously released the Pentagon Papers in the 1970s, proving the fallacies of what the American public were getting about Vietnam. And so they have put this statement forward, and you should all read it. This copy is from Consortium News, and use this August recess while Congress is in the home districts to find them. You know, they shouldn't have any comfort during this vacation period. We have the entire edifice of this big lie about Russia and hacking the elections and everything that followed from that has to be overturned. And so you have to ask, well, how did this lie perpetrate itself? And in that, I'm reminded of a very famous aria from a very neat little comic opera by Giacomo Rossini called The Barber of Seville. This is called La Calunnia. or the slander. Here it is, paraphrased in English. The slander is a little wind, a very gentle little breeze, which nimbly, softly begins to whisper. Little by little, mildly, in a low voice, hissing, it goes flowing, it goes buzzing in people's ears. It enters deftly and makes heads and brains to blow. Getting out from mouth to mouth, the clamor grows. It slowly strengthens. It already flies from one place to another. It seems like the thunder, like a storm that in the depth of the forest goes whistling, rumbling, and makes your blood run cold. In the end, it spills over and blows up. It spreads, it doubles, it provokes an explosion like a cannon shot, a general tumult which makes the air shake. And the wretched one who is defamed, degraded, trampled, scourged by public opinion, slinks away and dies. And that, of course, is what the mainstream media would wish that Donald Trump is going to do. And I've got news for you. Donald Trump is not going to slink away and die. He is fighting this thing. But the problem is the game that they're playing, that explosion that Rossini is referring to, could actually be a nuclear war, because all these slanders and attacks are being accompanied by provocations almost to the day. So there's our job. Now there's another reality out there. As I said, the VIPs, Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, stepping forward, have proven without a doubt, ice cold, that this thing is a lie. And I'd like you to listen for a couple of minutes to William Binney, who was a national technical director for the National Security Agency, and what he had to say to our correspondent Jason Ross a few months ago. Okay, so that's from William Binney, and you can get the rest on our website, and you should, because our movement, the LaRouche movement, the Schiller Institute, we are bringing this truth to the world. So, and the VIPS people have put themselves forward at some risk. Many of them quit their jobs after September 11th because of the abuses that crept in terms of violation of civil liberties and so forth after the September 11th attack. So how did this happen? And give me the next slide there, Mike. How did this happen? Well, you heard the testimony, some of you did, suffered through it in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and here you have them. The one on the far left is James Comey, who is Barack Obama's appointee for chief of the FBI. Then in the center is James Clapper, Obama's appointee for Director of National Intelligence, and on the far right, John Brennan, Obama's appointee to head the CIA. So you see a certain pattern here. But we could also include Susan Rice, perhaps, in there of the NSA. But our hypothesis here today is much deeper than that. Is that we contend that these agencies, from their very inception, have functioned as a fifth column in the United States for corruption, misdirection, and subversion by the British Empire. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been duped almost to the point of extinction by an enemy which most Americans can't even see. People say the British Empire, that went out of business 100 years ago. Or they might say, as I have heard Congressman John Culbertson say on more than one occasion, the British, they are our oldest and friends and allies and dearest allies in the world. But most of your friends say, I can't figure out what's going on. It's too crazy. I just give up. So we have to figure this out. And in order to do that, it's important that we go back to who we are as Americans and why our nation is unique. And here we have the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, which is, it's worth studying every 4th of July and carrying it in our hearts. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So what does that mean? How are we equal? We look around the room here today. Obviously, we're not all physically equal, right? Different races, different backgrounds, young, old. Some were born in the United States, some not. So we're not equal in that respect, but we are equal in the creative spark that God gave us all, right? That distinguishes us from all lower species, and that that we can have a creative existence. That is really what the pursuit of happiness means. Felicity with the direction of the universe, and actually accomplishing some good with our lives and improving upon nature through industry, through scientific advance, as no lower species can do. And this was embodied implicitly in our Declaration of Independence. It was made more explicit in the Constitution, and also the contributions that Alexander Hamilton gave us later in the field of physical economy. And of course, Lyndon LaRouche took it a lot more farther than that in his contributions in the 20th century. But let's look at the other side of the aisle. Let's look at the British Empire. Okay, well, there she is. Yep. And this stamp, I think, was made sometime in the 1950s, but it still says there, British Empire and the Commonwealth Games. So they obviously thought the empire still existed then, but I just think that picture's just too pretty. Mike, why don't you give me the next one? There they are. So that's a different concept of man. All men and women are not created equal. Bloodlines, race determine things. An oligarchy of wealth and privilege. Nations don't rule the world. Money rules the world. Nations should just get out of the way and let the free market do its thing. So anybody here that thinks that the American way is free market economics, you don't know anything. That is what we fought the American Revolution against. In the old days, free market was called empire. And since the mortgage crash of 2007, since there's been over $16 trillion pumped by the Federal Reserve into these markets to juice them up, I think it went over 22,000 last week on the Dow. Anybody who thinks that's free isn't really thinking. How about happiness? How about scientific progress? Well, no, scientific progress gets man out of the beast-like existence. Now, we want to suppress scientific progress under the empire. Anyone heard of the environmentalist movement? The climate change scare that says we have to shut down carbon-based industries, and as certain more honest of them like Prince Philip say, reduce the world's population down to a fraction of its current level, starting with the darker skinned races. So the right to life guaranteed in the Declaration of Independence doesn't exist under the empire. And how about happiness? Well, since we're just uncreative beasts, happiness is just whatever sordid pleasure we can witness from one moment to the next. Look at the opiate epidemic now. And those of us that lived before and after the John F. Kennedy assassination, I did, remember how rapidly the optimism of John Glenn and NASA, the space program, was replaced by a flood of narcotics and degenerate culture in the wake of the Vietnam War. And how about this last question? England as our dear and oldest friend and ally, Mike? Well, Shakespeare talked about this in a play called Othello, okay? Othello, the Moor of Venice, because of course at that moment in history, the beautiful Renaissance culture of England was being overwhelmed by the Venetian Empire. The Venice, which had been the center of usurious finance and intrigue, was transplanting itself, much as how the British Empire transplanted itself into the United States in the 20th century. And here you have on the left, poor Othello in agony, and his dear, trusted friend and ally, and your true and honest friend. And I have a handkerchief here that proves that your wife is cheating with this other guy, and so forth. So, and at the end of the tragedy, Othello ends up murdering his own innocent wife. But that's the kind of intelligence we've been getting lately out of the CIA and the likes, of the kind of intelligence that's wooing us to our own destruction. So, Mike. So the founding of our nation was almost a miracle. Coming out of the Constitutional Convention, Ben Franklin said, "I give you a republic if you can keep it." But the empire did not quit. Most people know, of course, that in the War of 1812, actually happened in 1814, the British military forces came and burned down Washington, D.C. But even prior to that, the natural extension of the empire of the American system, revolutionary spirit into Europe, was frustrated in France, where an auspicious revolution turned into a bloody mess with a bunch of degraded Jacobin mobs decapitating most of the American revolutionary networks there. Marquis de Lafayette barely escaped with his life. The king, Louis, who had authorized the arms shipments that enabled us to win the revolution, was decapitated. And the American Revolution's networks there were very much demoralized. But Mike, in the U.S., there were constant operations to subvert and corrupt us and destroy us. But we did have a patriotic intelligence service of a sort very early on. A lot of it growing out of a fraternity called the Society of Cincinnatus, which was made up of American Revolutionary War veterans. So here you see here on the far left, Washington Irving, then James Fenimore Cooper, Samuel Morse, and Edgar Allan Poe. And of course, people will say, well, I thought those guys were authors. They were poets. Well, yes, they were. Was it just a cover story for their intelligence activity? Well, in a way, sometimes it did work like that. And Samuel Morse was a accomplished artist, as a matter of fact. But when you consider that the imposition of empire is not just a question of a military coming in to take over, but to corrupt people to the level of bestiality by which they will accept empire. Think about the Roman Colosseum and all of that. Then these intelligence networks were very much also engaged in promotion of a positive American culture. So we're going to move forward. Throughout the 19th century, the United States withstood constant assaults on its sovereignty from an empire committed to our destruction. The most obvious assault was the promulgation of the degraded slaveocracy of the Confederacy. It was a true oligarchical system where a handful of privileged landowners lorded over everybody else. And I don't mean just the black slaves. I mean the white population. The unproperty white population had no rights whatsoever under the Confederacy. Although they end up fighting and dying in the war, anyone that owned over 20 slaves did not have to fight in the war. That was the law of the Confederacy. And the British supported the Confederacy. They ran arms. They ran, of course, where was most of the cotton going? The cotton was going to London. And France had been lost to the oligarchy. There was only one nation in Europe whom Abraham Lincoln could count upon as an ally for the Union in the Confederacy. Does anybody here want to guess who it was?
Russia.
Yeah.
Russia, absolutely. Russia, Tsar Alexander. And in fact, the Russians sent their fleets over. The Pacific Fleet docked in San Francisco, the Atlantic Fleet docked in New York, and they successfully kept the British from committing themselves to the cause of the Confederacy officially. We actually laid this out years back by a study that I think was done by Don Fowle of our movement called the U.S.-Russian Entente that Saved the Union. So, but then of course the British Empire throughout the 19th century continued to grow and expand its influence. It brought famine and destruction to India and imposed an opium plague on China. It looted Africa of its resources. And of course, this was all called free market economics, right? Supply and demand, don't you know? But the US pulled through it, Mike. And in a mere 11 years out of the Civil War, this devastating Civil War, President Ulysses S. Grant hosted the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876 and invited the entire world to the United States. And what did they see? They saw the most advanced steam engines in the world, the most advanced agricultural technologies, right? The wonders of what a positive credit policy can do. And this became a spark for American Revolution ideas in terms of the economic direction to propagate throughout the world, much to the concern and distress of the empire. So despite everything, our nations moved forward. Citizens knew that our nation was unique in the world. And that people knew that the mortal enemy of our nation was the British Empire. But that all changed as we entered the 20th century.
Oh, what are the names of both of the pictures there?
I'm going to tell you. Here we have on the left William McKinley. William McKinley was the last Union veteran to serve in the presidency. You'd have to call him the last Abraham Lincoln Republican. On the far right is Andrew Carnegie. one of his chief industrial allies, the great railroad builder, the great steel magnate, you know, and Carnegie had grown up from poverty to create a productive empire of sorts on steel and industrial advance. On the top is one of his steel plants. Carnegie envisioned a railroad from North America all the way down to the tip of Argentina, and also and that railroad has not yet been built today, as a matter of fact, and also a canal across the Isthmus of Darien in Colombia. On the bottom is another piece of infrastructure maybe you're not aware of. That is the Galveston seawall. Okay, because Galveston was devastated by a hurricane in 1900 that practically wiped it out, and the McKinley mobilized the whole nation to build a 17-foot seawall to have command over nature. That's also when the Houston Ship Channel was built, pretty much during the same period. So how did the oligarchy frustrate and stop this positive motion of industrial progress? War. That's how they did it. They the drumbeat for a war with Spain. Okay, you had a kind of a September 11th type incident occur with the mysterious explosion of the battleship Maine in the harbor of Havana, Cuba. A fellow named Teddy Roosevelt, who had been brought in as Assistant Secretary of Navy, but happened to be running the show at the Naval Department that day, deployed ships without McKinley's approval to Philippines for a military confrontation with Philippines. And so, yes, the U.S. went to war with Spain, and the booty we got for that was Puerto Rico, Guam, Philippines. They all became American possessions. And so from the standpoint of Teddy Roosevelt anyway, you know, this was the beginning of an American empire, right? But of course, McKinley did not like that. He was very reluctant to get into that war. In fact, the U.S. media had a very big role to play in that. Both Pulitzer and a guy named William Randolph Hearst just beat the drum for war. Hearst, a couple of years later, launched a little operation here in Houston called the Houston Chronicle. That started in 1901. But to patch things up and to provide a new positive direction for development of our hemisphere, McKinley sponsored a Pan-American exposition in Buffalo, which was a very natural place to have it because this was the terminus of the Erie Canal as it headed toward Lake Erie. And as you see in the central picture, McKinley was shot at that exposition. Teddy Roosevelt, who had made himself a phony hero charging up the San Juan Hill in Puerto Rico, was foisted on McKinley as his running mate in the 1900 elections. And so he was now president of the United States. There he is on the right side. Now, who was Teddy Roosevelt? Well, this is a cartoon from the period. Teddy Roosevelt and his big stick. Have you heard that one before? Speak softly and carry the big stick. Well, the big stick Teddy Roosevelt deployed was against the South American nations. He wrote something called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine that said, even though technically, yes, the founding Monroe and Quincy Adams said that British and other colonial imperial powers cannot do business and taking over property in our hemisphere, we as Americans can collect the debt on their behalf. So the U.S. became the debt collector for the Rothschilds and the Barings and the other banking interests against our neighbors to the south. And of course, when Roosevelt beat up the nation, he'd say, bully. This was his thing, because Roosevelt was very, very British in his outlook. He was through his uncle, a fellow named James Dunwoody Bullock. He was very closely tied to the Confederacy. Bullock was the head of the Secret Intelligence Service for the Confederacy. He married a Cabot in his first marriage, the Cabot family of Boston, the Boston Brahmins, right? But also through and on, he was tied to the Gracie family of New York, if anyone's heard of Gracie Mansion in New York City. He went to England. He came under the sponsorship of a fellow named Lord Cecil Rice, and Rice would become King Edward's ambassador to the United States. But at that time, he was involved in setting up a secret police of sorts in England. Now, the fellow on the right, that's a statue of Albert Pike. Albert Pike, the convener of the Ku Klux Klan and a big honcho in the Scottish Rite Freemasons. And this statue was erected in Judiciary Square in Washington, D.C. in 1901. As basically making it official that we were going to be in league with the empire at that point. So, with Teddy Roosevelt in the presidency, the U.S. for the first time in our history was being dragged against our will into alliance with our mortal enemy, the British Empire, an empire still despised by most Americans. To enforce this shift, Teddy Roosevelt moved to create a permanent national police force. And who do we have here? Well, his attorney general was a guy named Charles Bonaparte, who was, as his name would suggest, a nephew or a great nephew of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Ralph Vanderman was deployed to Philippines to use Philippines as a social laboratory for just totally subduing that nation, which had been a Spanish and a Catholic nation, but Teddy Roosevelt saw it as going to turn it into a sweatshop, a rubber plantation, slave labor, and so forth.
Sorry, which country?
Philippines, okay? And, but you also had Claude Dancy, who was a top British oligarch who had worked with Scotland Yard, and he came over to the United States to basically work with Bonaparte and Vanderman in terms of setting up a domestic secret police and called the Bureau of Investigation. So Bonaparte told the Congress, this was in 1906, that we need a force of permanent police under its control. And I'm quoting one Kentucky Democrat congressman named Joseph Shirley. He said, an instrument so dangerous should never be given an executive power unless safeguarded in every way against abuse. Ours is not a system of spying on men and prying into what would ordinarily be designated as their private affairs to determine whether or not a crime has been committed. To which Teddy Roosevelt replied that interference by Congress will only benefit one class of people, and that is the criminal class. There is no more foolish outcry than this against spies. Only criminals need fear our detectives. Well, the Bureau of Investigation was put through and became policy. Now, skipping ahead a few years, Teddy Roosevelt helped get Woodrow Wilson into the White House by running a third-party ticket called the Bull Moose ticket. I think that was 1912. And Woodrow Wilson was a ardent, enthusiastic supporter of the Ku Klux Klan. He invited the Ku Klux Klan into Washington. The first big Hollywood movie was called Birth of a Nation, glorifying the Klan. You don't hear about this too much. There was also a group called the American Protective League. As we went into World War I, the Department of Justice was handing out deputy badges all over the place. You know, if you could be deputized in the wink of an eye and go think on your neighbor. The American Protective League went after blacks, it went after Irish, it went after Native Americans, and so forth. And of course, as I said, we were going into World War I. People did not want to enter a war in league with the British Empire. And so there were draft resistors among the Irishmen. You can obviously figure out why, German Americans, others. The American Protective League was the one that would round them up and haul them in for prosecution. And one young fanatic who was part of this just out of law school, right, was a fellow named J. Edgar Hoover. And J. Edgar Hoover was put in charge of the Department of Justice's War Emergency Division's Enemy Alien Bureau. There he ran brutal counterinsurgency operations, working directly with Van de Man for 35 years. Now, as everyone knows, you've seen the movies about the Roaring 20s. The Roaring 20s, you had an explosion of criminal activity, right? Al Capone and so forth in Chicago. Crime became organized for the first time as networks were set up to run booze into the United States to escape prohibition. Most of it came from Canada and from Caribbean British protectorates. But somehow the FBI in the Bureau of Investigation was not too interested in going after this. They were going after communists and subversives of various sorts, right? And after prohibition was lifted, after Roosevelt became president, then those same networks began bringing in other merchandise like cocaine and illicit drugs. So take a look at this, right? There's old J. Edgar on the left side, and then all the presidents in which he was the head of the FBI. Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, Franklin Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and it wasn't until Richard Nixon that the old guy kicked the bucket, thank God, and went to his final reward, right? But, there was one president, of course, Coolidge and Hoover really didn't have too much problem, particularly Coolidge, with what Hoover was up to. But Franklin Roosevelt won by a landslide in 1932 as a total repudiation of Wall Street, total repudiation of the immoral policies of the 1920s. And one of his allies was a fellow senator from Montana named Thomas Walsh, who Roosevelt brought in as chairman of the Democratic Party, ousting Jacob Raskin of National City Bank, who had tried to sabotage Roosevelt's nomination. So from his Senate seat, Walsh had grilled J. Edgar Hoover, accusing the FBI of running an orgy of terror, violence, and crime against citizens and aliens. He also exposed how the FBI would actually create provocative actions to entrap honest citizens into criminal acts to face arrest, prosecution, and maybe deportation. So a week before his inauguration in March of 1933, Franklin Roosevelt announced that he was going to have Thomas Walsh become Attorney General of the United States. And this was reported in the New York Times. Walsh's pledge that he would reorganize the Department of Justice when he assumes office, probably with an almost completely new personnel. Well, the very next day, Thomas Walsh was found dead on a train on his way to Washington, D.C. for the inauguration of Roosevelt. There was an FBI or a Bureau of Investigation agent on that train. The son-in-law requested an autopsy, which was refused. And Franklin Roosevelt, who had just escaped an assassination attempt himself in Miami, was very shaken by all of this, but he never after that challenged J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI. Now, there was another president named John F. Kennedy who also wanted to move against this internal corruption in our justice system. He even appointed his own brother, Bobby Kennedy, to be the Attorney General of the United States. And our movement is very privileged to have as one of our dear friends a veteran congressman from New Jersey named Neil Gallagher, who worked directly with Kennedy. And we're going to hear just a few minutes of his reflection right at the point of the Kennedy assassination. And there's more, and you should watch this whole interview on our website. Tears your heart out. But anyway, let's move quickly to the present. Even after J. Edgar Hoover died, his spirit permeated the agency. When the Democratic Party came back with Jimmy Carter, it was a totally different party. Instead of the party of science and progress and future direction, it was the Green Party. It was the anti-science party, right? The FBI was deployed during the Carter period in vicious frame-ups aimed at trade unions like Roy Wilkins of the Teamsters, pro-labor Democratic senators like Harrison Williams, and there was a special unit set up to go after African-American politicians. This was called Operation Fremention. Of course, this continued beyond just Carter. But there was something else going on in the world during that period. Yes. Who's that educated fellow over in the back with the pipe, huh? That's Lyndon LaRouche. This was in 1971 at Queens College in New York City. 71 was the year that President Nixon took the dollar off gold and created the beginning of this whole edifice of casino finance that has engulfed the world. LaRouche had built a movement on the ground that forced Abel Lerner, this Fabian economist, into a debate and forced him to admit that the consequences of this action, the pyramiding of debt, and then the crushing of living standards to collect on this debt, would lead toward fascism, as in Hjalmar Schacht's fascism as the economic mastermind of the Hitler regime. And Abel Lerner says, well, people of Germany had just paid their bills on that time, then Hitler would not have been necessary. And that kind of put the icing on the cake for everyone in the audience there. Next. We began to figure out how FBI counterinsurgency, radical operations worked. This was it's published by the National Caucus of Labor Committees, which was the parent organization. This was called Papa Doc Baraka Fascism in Newark, where Newark was made a test tube by the insurance companies for radical violent activity to effectively burn the city down and repopulate it by the gentry. But we figured it out. Next. And LaRouche actually recruited a mass movement. And if you look very closely in that picture there, somewhere in that mass of people, there's a guy with a beard and a mustache and hair down to his shoulders, and that is me, because this is the first of labor committee event that I attended. Yeah, there I am, right after the Carter inauguration. That's where I kind of found this movement, or it found me, and thank God that happened. Okay, but anyway, now we're going to come into the present, Mike. Who is this son of a gun here, huh? Well, this is James Comey. Okay, this was Barack Obama's appointee to head the FBI. That quote on the upper right corner, it was sort of a J. Edgar Hoover moment, right? Where, and you know, what you remember what happened? You had the uproar around the emails, right? You had the recusal of Jeff Sessions saying he could not, in an unbiased way, participate in this thing. You had, and then Comey was fired by President Trump, and this caused a big uproar. I know that my Congressman Al Green has used this for the basis for saying that Trump has to be impeached. But what was the J. Edgar Hoover moment that he's talking about here, Mike? Well, this has to do with an MI6 agent. MI6 is the British Foreign Intelligence Service, who came up with this dossier, and I'm not, it's pretty X-rated, okay? So I'm not going to read it to you, but it says, you know, something about Trump's perverted conduct in Moscow included hiring the presidential suite of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, you know, where he knew President and Mrs. Obama, whom he hated, had stayed on one of their official trips to Russia, and defiling the bed where they slept, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, yes, indeed, this would have been a J. Edgar Hoover moment where Comey went up to President Trump. You don't want this to come out in the public, do you? You know, the fact that you compromised yourself in Moscow, right? Because that's what J. Edgar Hoover was famous for. He had sex files on everybody. Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, you know, everybody, you know, and this goes on. You remember Elliot Spitzer? You remember him? Right? He was going after the Wall Street banks in his own way. And he unfortunately went into the Mayflower Hotel, and that was the end of it. Okay, next. But there's a lot more we could say about Comey, but let's just look at one aspect of his career prior to being appointed by Obama. In fact, immediately before being appointed by President Obama, Comey was hired in the private sector to work with something called HSBC Holdings. What's that? Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. Okay, Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation had been proven by the 11 Intelligence Committee hearings to have laundered $17 billion for the Sinaloa cocaine cartel, which you see over on the right there. Did anybody go to jail? No. They paid a fine, but no one was prosecuted. And just to be on the good side of the feds, HSBC put him on a salary to just make sure everything was even Steven, right? But of course, HSBC has a long history because it was the official opium bank of the British Empire. It was based in Hong Kong. It was all legal back then. Maybe Michelle knows a little bit about the opium wars and so forth, right? But that's a picture of an opium den here. But this movement, Mike, maybe you can put it back on me for a second here. Yeah. This is the book, 1978, where our movement took on HSBC. You know, and darn near stopped the first foreign banking takeover in the United States. Dope Incorporated, right? Dope Incorporated, exposing how the British were running drugs through the banking system, which was being deregulated step by step by step. We almost stopped it. We didn't succeed. Jimmy Carter intervened on behalf of the bank. But that's what our movement's been. It's been David and Goliath all along. So continuing. A personal footnote on this thing is whatever happened to Albert Pike and J. Edgar Hoover. Well, this edifice in Washington, D.C. is the Scottish Rite Freemasonic Temple, okay? Now, you see the other building in the background? That's called the Chastleton Apartments. And when I first joined this movement, I lived there, as a matter of fact. I was a curious young man of 21. You know, I said, well, what the heck? You know, let me go over and knock on the door, you know. And they assumed I was going to get inducted into the Freemason. Come inside, my son, right? And they showed me, they gave me the book on Jacques de Molay and the Rosicrucians. You know, somewhere in that building, Albert Pike is actually buried, you know, in the wall. And I don't know if I saw the crypt. I don't know. But at the end of it all, they said, but let's show you what we're most proud of, right? They took me to the very back. What was there? The office of J. Edgar Hoover. They had taken the entire office from the FBI building and spirited it over to the Scottish Rite Freemasonic Temple, right, as their proudest controller of policy. And of course, when you're a 33rd degree Freemason, that's above everything else, any oath, the marriage, or anything else. Of course, marriage is something that Hoover never concerned himself with because while he had sex files on everybody else, he had a pretty bizarre sex life of his own, but you'll have to read that somewhere else. Next. And the last thing here, I want you to look at this, these two pictures here. On the right, that's that old Albert Pike. You know, we had a campaign to get that statue torn down. We did not succeed, but it was fun. And in fact, on the right, the guy holding the microphone is Anton Chaikin, who co-authored our book Treason in America, who wrote a lot about this. On the left are three collaborators and co-thinkers, particularly the two on the far left. The one on the left is Reverend James Bevel, who was Martin Luther King's key lieutenant in Birmingham, what was called the Children's Crusade, recruiting young kids to march as their parents had already been hauled off to jail. And Bevel, in 1992, courageously stepped forward to be Lyndon LaRouche's running mate. He was LaRouche's vice presidential candidate while LaRouche was sitting in federal prison. The woman in the middle is Amelia Boynton Robinson, who, those of you that saw the movie Selma, she was the lady that led the Selma civil rights crusade and almost lost her life on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on what's known as Bloody Sunday. For years, decades, she was the vice president of the Schiller Institute, and Helga LaRouche considered her adopted mother, right? She's now deceased, and the fellow on the far right is Hosea Williams, also a collaborator of King's. But we've continued to fight these guys, you know, on the highest possible level. Okay, next. So I want to talk a little bit about the CIA, because FBI is supposed to be just domestic intelligence. CIA is international. And during World War II, Franklin Roosevelt tried to cobble together a patriotic intelligence service that would serve the national interest. Roosevelt considered Russia our ally against fascism. And Roosevelt had great dreams as to how the world could come together without any empire after the war. The institutions that he created, like the United Nations, for example, were seen as a community of nations for world peace. So his intelligence service was headed by the fellow on the left there, William Ray Donovan. It was called the Office of Strategic Services. The fellow on the right was Max Corvo in Italy, who was a dear friend of our movement while he was alive. He was one of the people that was actually working with the Vatican to work out terms of surrender for the Japanese, because, you know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not necessary. Japan was willing to negotiate surrender, and Corvo was in the middle of all that, but there was sabotage coming from elsewhere. Mike? Within the same intelligence services, you had this Anglophile faction, which was principally, we see here, Allen Dulles and James Jesus Angleton. You know, and the Dulles brothers were a scourge on this nation through their whole existence. You know, Dulles was pro-Hitler. Frankly, the British had no problem with Hitler, as long as he was just moving eastward and killing Poles and Slavs and Russians and so forth. It wasn't until he turned on the empire that they began to have to think things through. And so I'm going to read a quote from you, from LaRouche himself, which is an article which was called in 2013, called "What Was the Real Agenda Then?" And it's about the time that Roosevelt was at the point of death. This is LaRouche. There was a time when two prominent members of the World War II intelligence services were walking down a White House corridor. One, a high-ranking intelligence officer, to meet with President Franklin Roosevelt in the president's private office. A second prominent member of the Office of Strategic Services waited outside the office. As the OSS chief walked out along the corridor, he muttered softly to his companion, "It's over." And a moment later, as they walked, "It's over." A few decades later, I was engaged in a related kind of role in our nation's intelligence services in 1982 to 83, when I would experience a similar defeat of what might have been identified as our nation's intelligence services, this time not as part of the OSS, but in my prominent role in launching the SDI project. So what did he mean by "it's over"? Well, Allen Dulles and John Jesus Angleton won the day in absolute league with Harry Truman, who was a moral pipsqueak that became Roosevelt's running mate in his last run. Think again about Teddy Roosevelt being foisted on McKinley. So what the CIA became was the architect of coups and assassinations and regime change all around the world, right? Nations that had hoped to escape from the grip of empire coming out of World War II were given a choice to either subject themselves to Wall Street demands or be labeled as communist and have your government overthrown accordingly. right? And the third world nations tried to maneuver around all of this by setting up something called the non-aligned movement. And LaRouche worked with a lot of these leaders, like Ali Bhutto, who was imprisoned and killed, like Indira Gandhi, who was assassinated, right? But our movement was not quiet during that period. And I'll come back to, yeah, there you go. This is the New Solidarity newspaper back then. Bare worldwide CIA takeover brainwash plot, okay? Very, very straightforward. You know, we went out and told the truth, okay?
What year and month?
That was January 11th, 1974, okay? So can you take me back to that other picture there? And so what you had was the death of Roosevelt. You know, and the end of the war did not happen until Roosevelt was dead. Even though Roosevelt won the war, he did not win the peace. So you had the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki unnecessarily, you know, for the world to understand that the U.S. was going to be top dog henceforward. Franklin Roosevelt was invited over to Mike Carter's home state of Missouri to speak in Fulton. You know, Churchill, I'm sorry. Who did I say? Roosevelt, I'm sorry. Churchill was invited over to Fulton, Missouri, and gave his famous Iron Curtain speech, which just divided the world. The world was going to be divided between godless communism and radical free market, i.e. Wall Street and London in the West. And the fellow on the far right is Joe McCarthy, you know, who launched just a jihad, right, of terror and fear, in league with the FBI and Roy Cohn, to basically tar and feather any intellectual, any thinker that had a noble aspiration for our nation, where our nation should go, coming out of World War II. There was one CIA, coming out of the Nixon period, there were some inquiries into the abuses of the CIA run by something called the Church Committee. There were hearings in Congress. And there was one CIA director named William Colby who actually did put some of the dirty laundry out there for people to see. So there were certain reforms that were called for, and Colby was found a few years later dead, you know, in a capsized canoe in the Chesapeake Bay, in something that looked very much like a CIA hit. Does anybody here remember who became the CIA director after Colby?
George Bush.
Right.
Yeah,
there he is, George Bush, right? And on the left, we have Henry Kissinger. Actually, I should say it's actually Sir George Bush and Sir Henry Kissinger, because they were both knighted by the Queen, don't you know, for services to the empire. You know, Bush ran the CIA under Jerry Ford. Kissinger ran the National Security Agency under Nixon and Ford. He was later dumped by Ford from the NSA for running operations beyond the scope of what even Jerry Ford could stomach. But nonetheless,
and accepting knighthood from a monarch
yes,
in the Constitution.
And you can read a lot more about that in this book, Treason and the unauthorized biography of George Bush, which goes into great detail. I'm just going to skip over it. But you know, at the hearings for CIA, because he had to go under scrutiny from the Senate, Bush was asked by John Stennis, a senator from Mississippi, I thought if you were seeking the presidential nomination by the way the route of becoming director of the CIA, I would question your judgment most severely. Ha, ha, ha. Next. Well, actually, Bush was running for president, and he did think he had it coming to him on a silver platter. But there was another candidate that year named Lyndon LaRouche, and it was his activity on the ground. Maybe some of the people in this room were in New Hampshire that year. There was a leaflet that went out, said, if you like Jimmy Carter, you'll love George Bush, right, which the Reagan people picked up. This was LaRouche and Reagan together at a forum in Concord, New Hampshire, and as two World War, they actually hit it off with each other. There was a dialogue that commenced early on.
1980? What year was that?
1980. Yep. 1980. And also during that same, period, we actually, going back to 1973, there was a publication come into existence called the Executive Intelligence Review. Okay, so there was another source of intelligence out there other than George Bush's, CIA contaminated view of the world. And there were people in the Reagan administration that were very interested in what we were saying. And and so history changed. Now Bush continued the covert activities. He had been brought onto the Reagan team probably through certain sort of underhanded deals involving the release of the hostages in Iran, and the price in return was the beginning of the arming of the Iranians to fight Saddam. So Bush was overseeing something where the U.S. was arming Iran to fight Iraq and arming Iraq to fight Iran, in which 7 million people were killed. But President Reagan did something very good and positive and powerful, is that he adopted Lyndon LaRouche's idea for the Strategic Defense Initiative, which said that we could work peacefully with Russia to bring an end to the threat of nuclear war by both sides developing these anti-missile lasers that could make, as President Reagan said on TV, the nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. But you have to imagine the rage of Bush, that his authority, that his also great acumen and expertise in intelligence matters was being challenged by a guy whom he hated, Lyndon LaRouche. So let's go back. Let's go forward, Mike. Into the present. This is John Brennan. This was the Obama appointee to head the CIA, who was expostulating at the Senate hearings. Well, can you prove, that Putin hacked the elections? These are very serious charges. This is a matter of war. Give us some evidence. What did Brennan say? Oh, well, we don't do evidence. We just make assessments. And they're a highly confident assessment that Russia did this. Okay, let's see a little bit about who Brennan is. Next. Brennan was the CIA station chief in Saudi Arabia from 1994 to 1999. There he is meeting with some of the Saudi princes. And many of you know the work that this movement has done, on the question of Saudi Arabia's role in the September 11th terror attacks. The most obvious thing is that 15 of those hijackers were Saudi nationals. Did we invade Saudi Arabia? No. We invaded Iraq. We invaded Afghanistan, the poorest country in the world, right? This is what Brennan said on the question of Yemen. This was on a PBS interview. Saudi Arabia has done more for Yemen than any other country in the world. Whenever I go out to Yemen, I invariably visit Saudi Arabia first, as well as after my visits there. Also, the drone killings, okay? Brennan was the guy that would come to President Obama every week with these baseball cards on who are we going to kill with drones. He actually set up a drone base for the United States in Saudi Arabia to run these attacks, and their specialty was hospitals, weddings, and kindergartens. They really didn't, and of course, if you were thinking about being a terrorist but weren't sure and your brother was killed by a drone, that you'd want to sign me up for ISIS, right? But also about hacking. Everyone's screaming about hacking. Does anyone here remember that Brennan hacked the computers of the U.S. Senate on this question of the torture report that Dianne Feinstein and others were putting together? No proof. No proof on the hacking charges, only a highly confident assessment. Now, the last of the three creeps, okay? This is James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, okay? Now, I didn't even know what the Director of National Intelligence was. That actually is a position that only came into existence in 2004, supposedly with Dianne Feinstein and others saying, well, what were the oversights? How could we have missed what was happening? How come we didn't see it coming in 2001? We need a man that can coordinate all the agencies and come up with an intelligence assessment that can reconcile all these varying opinions, right? So he has to tell the truth. But he was asked this question, in pertaining to when this question of wiretapping and so forth came out, and he was asked by Senator Wyden of Oregon. He says, "Well, we have the story that we have hundreds of millions of downloads. Now, I want to ask you, could you give me a yes or no answer to the question? Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?" No, sir, it does not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently perhaps collect, but not wittingly, right? And then, of course, all the Snowden stuff began to come out. Millions of wiretaps, everyone's being scrutinized, heads of state, heads of governments, Yahoo, Verizon, Google, YouTube, all of this, right? Being scrutinized and processed by the NSA. And he was asked by Andrea Mitchell on NBC, well, what about this? He says, well, I responded in what I thought was the most truthful, or at least untruthful manner by saying no. And it all hinges on what you mean by the word collect, right? So there were objections in Congress to this guy being appointed to be the DNI, but President Obama stepped forward and said, well, this man, Clapper, possesses a quality that I value in all my advisors. We're willing to tell leaders what we need to know, even if it's not what we want to hear. Well, how about just telling us the truth, rather than what we need to know, huh? And I'm going to digress one little second here, because the question, what is the FBI doing these days? And there was a Chronicle article just a couple of days ago, which I right here. Federal agents searched the home of an ex-Trump aide, Paul Manafort, okay? And they went into his house and they looted the place, okay? To look for his ties, because, see, he had been an agent out front and open, working with the Yanukovych government of Ukraine, right? And all this, well, of course, that was the actual legitimate government of Ukraine. So what's the big deal, right? He was very open about this. Well, what happened to that government is that government was overthrown with, and it was nothing covert. Victoria Nuland bragged that the U.S. intelligence agency spent $5 billion over a period of years seeking out a bunch of proto-Nazis, unrepentant Nazis, supporters of Stefan Bandera and so forth, to violently overthrow the government with these street hooligans. Doesn't that constitute election tampering? Right? To bring it into the orbit of NATO so that they could then receive missiles and so forth. One little piece of Ukraine called Crimea, which is 90% ethnic Russian, took a peaceful referendum and says, no, we're not going to stick around here to be ethnically cleansed by these Nazis. And they voted to reaffiliate with Russia. What did you hear? Putin invaded Ukraine. That's what you're told, right? Putin invaded, well, at Crimea, but right, and that was also written into the sanctions that just happened. So next. Now we're going to talk about one more person who is we haven't talked about up till now. This is Robert Mueller. Okay, this is the now been appointed the special counsel. After Sessions recused himself from the whole Russiagate investigation, there was a hue and cry for a special counsel. This is Mr. Clean. This is the guy they appointed, right? Now, he is now impaneled a grand jury to consider charges against President Trump with the power to recommend impeachment. Now, who is this man? Well, he himself was also director of the FBI for a while. In fact, he took his post at the FBI on September 4th, 2001. 1 week to the day before the September 11th terror attacks. His predecessor, Louis Freeh, went on to become the attorney for a fellow named Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, particularly on a matter called Al Yamama, which was a British oil for arms deal. But Mueller, as head of the FBI, spent his entire tenure sabotaging inquiries into the real sponsors of the September 11th attacks. It was actually an inquiry in Congress, the 9/11 Commission. This is documented in something called Document 17, put together by Dana Lesserman and Michael Jacobson, right? That began to get at the Saudi role, but they could not get any cooperation from the FBI. Now you have to think about the criminality of all of this. They're faking the intelligence, on these wars, on the September 11th. Who were we told? Osama bin Laden, that somehow Saddam Hussein was involved in it. And you launch these wars where thousands of people go to suffer and fight and die. Millions of refugees, right? You can lay them at the feet of Mueller. But he has other crimes. He was also the one that involved in the legal opinions that justified Bush Sr.'s Christmas invasion of Panama in 1990, supposedly because Noriega was pro-drug. Well, there wasn't anybody more pro-drug than Bush. Anybody know what Oliver North was bringing back in those planes? It was cocaine. But one of the most colossal of Mueller's crimes was done earlier, because he was the state attorney in Boston that took the place of William Weld and oversaw the Get LaRouche task force. He directly instructed a fellow named John Markham, who was the prosecutor against our movement in the legal attacks on us. And the picture you see on the right there is in Leesburg, Virginia. I was in Virginia that day with the helicopters, the armored personnel carriers. This is the FBI with sledgehammers. See, the guy on the left is holding a sledgehammer so they could bash the door down. The FBI coming into our national headquarters, and looting the place. And they tried to invade LaRouche's personal residence with shoot to kill orders. They wanted a kind of a Waco shootout, but we did actually get President Reagan to intervene to call off the dogs. But Reagan had been very much weakened by then because the Iran-Contra business, all of our allies in the Reagan team were gone. Reagan had been nearly assassinated a few years before. This was right before the Reykjavik summit. But anyway, so this prosecution against LaRouche unfolded, directed by Mueller. Former Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey Clark, said this was the worst case of politically motivated prosecutorial abuse he had ever encountered. That succeeded in putting LaRouche and several of his associates in federal prison January 27th, 1989, 1 week to the day after George Bush Sr. became president. So President Trump, if you're watching this broadcast today, if you want to do something to stick it to the Get LaRouche or to the Get Trump task force headed by Robert Mueller, what you need to do is go out there and exonerate Lyndon LaRouche. That would really turn the tables on your adversaries, okay? So next. So what are we to do? Well, one thing that frustrates the oligarchy is that the man they're trying to demonize, Vladimir Putin, doesn't seem to respond according to profile, right? And one is that Putin, takes his responsibilities as president very seriously. His family was, 5 of his close relatives were actually killed by the Nazis when they occupied Russia with the blessings of people like George Bush and the British oligarchy. But he also prides himself in being an expert of judo, which has a certain philosophy to it, where you don't do what's expected, right? You don't respond, right, just according to profile. And so think about, with all the screaming and yelling about Ukraine a few years back, Putin responded by moving into Syria on the election of the invitation of the elected government there, saying, oh, okay, you're against ISIS, America, we're against ISIS, let's work together. Well, Mr. Obama was not interested in that, and it gave the lie that, of course, they had been working and arming ISIS to overthrow Assad. Okay, but President Trump, despite all the hullabaloo, met with Vladimir Putin for 2 hours in May at the on the sidelines of the G20 summit and worked out a ceasefire in Syria, which is actually held for about 6 weeks now. That is a miracle, right? People are moving back into Syria. We also remember when President Obama, when the whole hacking thing came out last December, seized a bunch of diplomatic properties, just stole them, Russian diplomatic properties in the United States, kicked people out of their residences and so forth. What did Putin do? Well, he actually invited the children of the American diplomatic corps to a Christmas party at the Kremlin, and so he responded not according to profile, but he also said, let's wait for the new president to come in and see what happens. Now, what's happened is with these sanctions that were just pushed through Congress this week or last week, they had to respond, and Putin did basically kick out, I think, 700 diplomats. And President Trump cracked a joke. Well, we've been trying to cut the budget anyway, but cut the payroll, yeah. But nonetheless, this is a very, very dicey game they're in. But for everything, President Putin has held on to the most fruitful basis for cooperation, Mike. And here we see it right here. This is up on the space station, where you have cosmonauts and astronauts, all smiles. We can't get to that space station anymore without the assistance of our Russian allies on this, right? And we have to keep that vision of the future of where we want to take mankind. The other problem our enemies have is that they're broke. Their financial system is rotten to the core. We've helped create a new option out there around the new Silk Road, right? Here in Houston, we're very much involved in the fight for NASA. But last thing, my challenge to all of you there is let's get 1 million signatures on this petition right now. It says text Trump 17 to 202-524-8709 to sign the petition. So thanks very much, and I'd be happy to take some questions. Thank you. Turn on the light.
I got it, yeah.
Oh, thanks. Any questions? I think it's pretty devastating. There's so much more that I could have said. I mean, if you want to go into the, corruption of the CIA, you got a week to talk about it.
Yeah, to revisit John Brennan and Obama. So he's the guy that met with Obama in the White House in the basement and would choose the kill list for drones to kill people in the Middle East.
And elsewhere, yeah, but mostly in the Middle East. Pakistan was a big target, yeah.
So for how long a period of time? That was for how many years?
Well, Brennan, before he was head of the CIA, was President Obama's counter-terror advisor, right? And so I guess it went on for the entirety of the
8 years.
The Obama presidency. And Obama said once, "I'm very good at killing." He really got a kick out of this.
Who would have thought?
Louise?
Yeah. So the National Intelligence Agency, is that what it's called? NIA?
No, there's the National Security Agency.
Okay. Okay, because as you're starting to, so what is the difference between that and the CIA?
Okay, the National Security Agency grew out of military intelligence. That fellow von de Man that I showed you, he was military, and they're mostly. I mean, I don't know all the differences, but the NSA is a much more kind of spooky agency. But they're the ones that do most of the data mining and so forth. Not the CIA. The CIA is involved in more, covert activities, all around the world. My Uncle Fred was actually a key operative in the NSA for years in Turkey, but it was a different morality then. I really liked my uncle, but he considered himself kind of a liberal Kennedy Democrat. What happened is, once again, as was after the September 11th attacks, this was used to justify all sorts of crazy illegal things. I mean, William Binney, the fellow that you saw, he was a very important man in the NSA, and he had designed a data mining program which would be very efficient in ferreting out possible, in terror operations in the making without violating the civil liberties of Americans. And what happened is that it was rejected. And what happened is that a different program was introduced that was 10 times more expensive, in which they mined everything, And this is what Ed Snowden was also doing. Now, Ed Snowden did something that Binney did not do. Ed Snowden actually downloaded some of these programs somehow and skedaddled out of there. Binney never took anything. However, but he did go to all the agencies and the Department of Justice and so forth to try to say, well, this is what's happening, right? He was a whistleblower. And in 2007, his house was raided by the FBI. This is while W. Bush was still president. Like he said, he was stepping out of the shower and they just came in and looted the place, held a gun to his son and so forth. And they grabbed his computers and everything. They didn't find anything because he wasn't taking any illicit data.
So he was never indicted?
I don't think so.
No, but he tried to set up his own company and the government sabotaged all the contracts.
Right.
He tried to destroy his life.
Right.
I wanted to just clarify one thing, which is, since this has come up, both Susan Rice and Henry Kissinger were not with the NSA, but with the National Security Council, which is an advisory body to the president.
Okay.
As opposed to the NSA, which is a data.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry about that.
I think the way to understand the difference is when we say that the NSA and the GCHQ, are the same kind of institution. The C stands for communications in GCHQ. So it's the data stuff. It's the virtual reality.
General Communications Headquarters.
Used to be called Signal Intelligence.
Signal, there you go.
Well,
Keisha's got a question.
I was just going to say, if you can, I think really the point is excellent, what you just went through in terms of the history here, how to get people, the American people, to see that this isn't just some, CSI, war games, this is like really challenging them to take responsibility, to be patriots, to take responsibility for their nation, and that the same operations who you just exposed right now, the same ones who are put forth the interview on CNN the other day, a guy by the name of Mudd,
Right.
called directly for called for President Trump's assassination. I don't know if you have that.
I have it right in front of me. I intended to include it. I forgot. But this was on CNN. Counterterrorism analyst Phil Mudd, who is very close to Mueller.
Yes.
Very close to Mueller, had a long career at the CIA and ended up as then FBI Director Mueller's senior intelligence advisor through 2010, openly stated in a CNN interview on August 10th that the Intelligence Committee was going to kill President Trump. Mudd said that Trump's defense of President Putin has compelled some federal employees to want to kill Trump. Let me give you one bottom line as a former government official. The government is going to kill this guy, Mudd said. He defends Vladimir Putin. There are State Department and CIA officers coming home at Langley and Foggy Bottom, CIA and state. They're saying, this is how you defend us. Not satisfied to threaten the president with assassination just once, he continued referring to the pre-dawn FBI raid on the house of Paul Manafort, who was briefly Trump's campaign manager and one of the people accused of colluding with Russia in Mueller's witch hunt. What did the Department of Justice say on Manafort? Mudd asked rhetorically. You can say what you want. A judge told us we had cause to search his home early in the morning because we don't trust this guy who was your campaign manager. The government is going to kill this guy because he doesn't support them. That was on,
to the president.
Yeah, and Manafort, yeah.
I think one thing that's really important for people to realize is that because of our fight, which was joined by these veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, who put out a report that proves that the whole thing is phony, they have used all these different people that Joe was just talking about to go after the presidency in a dirty, fake operation. Now there's a fight on where that could be shut down, and this attack on the president has been used like a red dye to identify every British treasonous agent inside the United States government and intelligence apparatus. And we can clean the whole thing out because they're now all out in the open. So that if this fight where the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity report is now picked up on by The Nation, which is one of the biggest left progressive publications in the country, by Bloomberg, which is one of the biggest Wall Street publications in the country, you know, it creates a situation in which this thing is being looked at, and all the trees in the forest, this whole apparatus that Joe was talking about that goes back over a century, could be cleaned out and shut down.
Ron?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, and you kind of proved the use of it here today, that not only did Lyndon LaRouche build this intervention and intelligence operation, he archived the entire thing. So if you go to the LaRouche site, if you go to the EIR archives, the tools and the capability of being the expert on this is right there for people to pull off and use. And so like we've been emphasizing on the petition, whatever, individuals being visible on this can have a profound role breaking this thing wide open. And it's really demonstrated what you did today.
One thing about the VIPS, their first report to then President George W. Bush, and I think they've issued about 50 reports as professional, intelligent people. This is how we disagree with the assessment putting forward. Their first one was to challenge the Colin Powell testimony in Congress about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Remember, they had a real hard time selling this war, you know, this war on Iraq, second war on Iraq, to the American people, right? You know, first they were trying to pin Saddam with September 11th. That didn't fly. You know, then Condi Rice said, we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud, right? But then they had a fellow who had some stature in the public mind, Colin Powell, to step forward and put forward this thing about yellow cake, uranium, and so forth to justify the war. And but does anybody know who it was that fed that information to Colin Powell?
Tony Blair.
Tony Blair, yes. Tony Blair, right? And of course, the VIPS was right on this thing, and there was just a court decision in England 2 weeks ago that said Tony Blair is off the hook, you know, because it's okay to lie to go with offensive war, even though that's a violation of the Nuremberg codes, you know, that were set at the end of World War II. Nuremberg codes do not apply in England. It's okay to lie to go to war over there. So this group has a real record. They don't, you know, they don't claim affiliation with one party or the other, you know, and we've got to make this thing propagate. And as I said, during the month of August, a lot of these congressmen are home. They have no right to a moment's peace of having, you know, voted up these sanctions, you know, before they came home. But we got to find them.
And letting John Brennan get away with saying, we don't do evidence.
Yeah, right.
You might make it, but they don't.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Betty, what do you think? You got any questions, Betty Harris?
Not right now. I'm just overwhelmed with all the excellent information that you've just given us.
How about you, Michelle?
I'm thinking, is Trump going to fight with North Korea?
Well, that's something I didn't talk about today. Look, the North Korea situation is a detonation point that that of course what you're reading in the media is very, very inflammatory. And does anybody here remember that Jimmy Carter got the Nobel Peace Prize for working out the North Korea thing?
No, I don't remember that.
You don't remember that?
What did he do? Or
What Jimmy Carter worked out, this was during the Bill Clinton presidency. He acted as the emissary thank you, Charles, for coming. Thank you very much. Thank you. Worked out a deal where North Korea would abandon its fuel enrichment program in exchange for Westinghouse, I think it was, building a couple of peaceful light water reactors that didn't have a weapons capability to them, right? And so that was worked out, and it was moving forward. But then Clinton left, and W. Bush and Cheney came in, and they blew the whole thing up. The axis of evil, right? Right? They trashed the whole treaty, right? And then they went in and invaded Iraq, right? Iraq had given up its nuclear weapons program. Look what happened to them. Libya, they gave up their nuclear weapons program. Look what happened to them. Both of their leaders were assassinated. The countries were thrown into chaos. So you look at the world from the vantage point of North Korea, and there's factions there, but you can see this paranoid response is being provoked. But of course, the deployment of the THAAD missiles in South Korea, which were rammed through in the dark of night during the last days of the Obama presidency, you don't need long-range missiles to hit from South Korea to North Korea. Those missiles are for Russia and China. Vladivostok, the whole industrial hub of East Russia is just a couple of 100 miles away, China. So this was the deal. So, you get different lines from Trump as from, Tillerson. But of course, what North Korea really needs is economic development. Let's get a railroad built through there from south to north and beyond into China and Russia, and bring North Korea into the new Silk Road. We might even see Korean reunification under those conditions.
I was going to say that apparently President Trump and President Xi Jinping of China had a phone discussion yesterday over these matters. And that's probably more real than a lot of the rhetoric, which should not be going on. But apparently part of the discussion, the White House readout later said that President Trump is very much looking forward to his visit to China, and that their relations have been very solid. And I think, that's really the what's going to keep an even keel on this situation. And it was pointed out to us today is that if that kind of relationship is then forged with the United States and Russia, which of course Trump is attempting to do, which is what the whole Russiagate is meant to stop, frankly, these hotspots that have been used, as you've been pointing out in your discussion, through decades of creating the basis of war, so that the British Empire can always have a way, if peace threatens to break out, if economic development threatens to break out, the British Empire can always destabilize. So, we're in a period where it's extremely volatile, but at least there's a dialogue. As long as you've got a dialogue between the heads of state, and assuming these heads of state don't get assassinated. I think that's the other thing we learned today, that's another method of the British Empire.
And of course, the petition, of course, is a very important flank. But the chief vulnerability of the Trump gang is that they really don't know economics. They really don't. And the Dow Jones going over 22,000 is not a cause for celebration. It's like 110-degree fever that you have just before you die, right? And in addition, with exonerating LaRouche, which could drive a stake through the heart of the military intelligence side of this thing, Glass-Steagall, which if President Trump would embrace that, against the objections coming from Mnuchin and others, he could recruit half the Democratic Party, or at least the half that's not, because the people on the ground don't believe this crap. And it's certainly not helping the Democratic Party to just become the McCarthyite party of jihad against Russia, right? But you see, if we don't get that, if we don't get Glass-Steagall back before the markets crash, then, who knows what you're going to get,
A lot of people will be hurt.
A lot of people will be hurt, and they'll blame it on Trump. Because see, if Trump takes credit when the markets go up, which he did, in West Virginia a couple of weeks ago, he's going to take the blame when they go down, So we don't need the darn markets, right? We need science and industry. We need a credit policy for the future, right? So I hope, I thank you very much.
Thank you, John.